Right then, this video is going to look at validity, and again this is adding information on top of what you already learnt for AS, and a few of these will be familiar, but hopefully you'll understand them in a little more depth at the end of this video. So validity, we're looking at, does our experiment or test or whatever questionnaire produce a result that is legitimate? So is your observed effect the same as what is out there in the real world? That's what we're basically looking at. So two main types. You've got internal validity, which is looking at is your result down to the change in the independent variable, or has it been affected by something else, a confounding variable, demand characteristic, so on. Has your change in the independent variable led directly to the change in the dependent variable? Is the tool measuring what it's supposed to measure? Does your IQ test actually measure IQ? If I measured the size of your forehead as a test of IQ, you would probably question what I was doing, because I wouldn't be measuring what I was trying to measure. So is it valid? Does it measure what it's trying to measure? External validity is whether your findings can be generalized beyond that one instance of research. Can it be generalized to other settings, other populations, other time periods? Okay, right, so let's carry on looking. Just a brief note on reliability and validity. So something can be reliable but not valid. So a really good example is a broken set of weighing scales. If it's not working properly, it'll probably give a false reading. So if I was to weigh like my mug on my set of weighing scales, and it told me every time that it weighed a kilogram, it would be reliable, but it wouldn't be valid because my mug does not weigh a kilogram. So another example is an IQ test. If it asks things like, do you like chocolate? It might still be reliable, like you'd give the same answer every time to that question, yes, but it would actually not be measuring IQ, so it wouldn't be valid. So you can have something that's reliable but not valid. So we're looking at, does it actually measure what it's supposed to measure? Right, ecological validity, we've talked about this a lot, but what we need to look at now is a little bit more detail about what it means. So here's our definition. The extent to which findings from a research study can be generalized to other settings and situations. So an example of that is, does that same obedience process that happened in Milgram take place in other settings, like a rundown university building, or in a school would the same thing take place, so on. So it's looking at, can it be generalized to other settings? Does it happen in other places? It's often really confused with something called mundane realism, and that is just about how much research is like real life. So we're not asked to give electric shocks to other people in real life, so Milgram lacked mundane realism. But you could say that the same process of obedience might take place in a number of different situations. So you could claim that Milgram had, fairly high ecological validity because it was showing that obedience hierarchy, but low mundane realism because electric shocks is not something that happens in real life. Another example is Asch's experiment, which had high ecological validity again because it's investigating that process of conformity that does occur in lots of different situations, but it really lacked mundane realism because of the artificiality of the task. So there's just a kind of a bit of a subtle difference between the two there, and hopefully we'll get you used to that. Right, temporal validity. This is another kind of external validity. Do your findings from your study hold true over time? So Asch was carried out in 1950s America, which was a particular time when people kind of towed the line. So if it was replicated today, would we find the same rates of conformity? Possibly not, because we're a lot more now about being individual and sticking to your guns, particularly in the UK. So you could claim that that study doesn't have temporal validity. Another example is Freud's penis envy, which I'm sure you've probably come across in the psychodynamic approach, and the suggestion with that is that that really reflected the kind of strict traditional Victorian society that he lived in, and it's not really valued as an explanation currently. Right, face validity. This is another kind of external validity, looking at, does our measuring tool appear to be doing what it should? Now, one or more, sorry, no, this is internal validity, because it's looking at the test itself and is it measuring what it should. It's not looking at external validity where it goes to other situations. So in this case, you get someone to judge whether the test is appropriate and suggest changes if necessary. Face validity, like, does it look on the face of it, is it doing what it's supposed to be? It doesn't need to be like a really complicated test. You know, just kind of common sense, someone looking at it should be able to tell that. Concurrent validity. Now this is about new measure, where you've created like a new test. You would want to compare those to an established valid test. So if you were to write an IQ test, we would want to compare the results of that to an established IQ test that's well respected and good at testing IQ. And if you find that you have a high positive correlation over 0.8, then you can say you've got good concurrent validity. If, however, you were to take the test, the new test, and it said, for example, that you had an IQ score of 80, and then you took an established test and it said you had an IQ score of 120, then you'd probably find that it had very low concurrent validity. Right, now the second section of this is just looking at how we improve validity, how we can keep validity high in our research. So first of all, looking at if you're doing an experiment, the first key thing is to use a control group. That means that you can compare your results where you've manipulated your independent variable, and you can compare that to your control group so that you can be really confident that what's happened is the change of the independent variable had an effect on the dependent variable. That's really key. And then another thing that you can do is standardize your procedures and minimize investigator effects by using single or double blind studies. And I've just put a reminder of those there for you. So it's about making sure that the only thing that has any effect on the dependent variable is your independent variable. Okay, questionnaires. Now, lots of questionnaires use something called a lie scale. And this is a set of items just checking whether the respondent has been truthful. So, for example, including nearly identical questions but just worded in a different way. Like, I never regret the things I say, and I've never said anything I later wished I could take back. You would expect the participant to answer the same to both, or give the same response. So they'd say no to I never regret no, they'd say yes to I never regret the things I say, and no to I've never said anything I later wished I could take back. Bit of a double negative there, isn't it? So the idea is you're making sure that the responses are consistent, and that can just check that you're getting a valid response. You can ensure participants that the data will be anonymous to control for the effect of social desirability bias. If you have social desirability bias in your questionnaire responses, that's going to really affect the validity of the data, because participants are not going to give truthful and honest responses, and that's obviously what you really want within a questionnaire. To know that your questionnaire is actually measuring what it's trying to measure, you've got to have honest responses from your participants. Okay, observations. To improve validity in observations, covert observations are obviously the best because participants don't know they're being watched, so they're going to have really high validity because you've got natural, authentic behaviour. that can easily be generalised to other situations because you know they're doing it without you manipulating them. And then the other thing that can affect it is poor behavioural categories can have a really negative impact on the validity of the data. So you end up not measuring what you're supposed to measure because you've got some kind of random category that doesn't make sense, or because you aren't able to answer it in a valid way because it's a poor category. Right, and then the last one is case studies and interviews, qualitative methods, anything that produces qualitative data. And these tend to have quite high validity because the depth of detail means that the findings reflect the participants' reality. Because you've got so much depth and detail, it tends to be valid. But what the researcher has to do, they have to demonstrate interpretive validity. And they have to show that their interpretation of events is the same as their participants. So they can do that by also by including direct quotes from the participant when they report back, showing that the participant directly supports their interpretation of events, and also by using a variety of sources like interviewing friends and family and so on. So that's validity.